My name is Tim McMullen. I will not be talking primarily on this one today, so I get to have a little bit of a break today. So quick housekeeping, then we can get started. We have your mics muted. Feel free to use the Q&A to ask questions, and we'll field those as we go. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Larry and Logan.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Tim. And everybody, thank you for joining today. I'm pleased to be a guest speaker today at this webinar. And so today what we're going to be talking about is about how what we're doing with my company, which is Mutara, and I'll introduce ourselves in just a minute, and kind of how we're using Grooper to really leverage artificial intelligence to improve student engagement and data quality. And so before we get into the topic at hand, I thought it would be good to just do a brief introduction. So I'm Larry Gray, as I mentioned. I am the CEO of Mutara, one of the founders. And you can kind of think of us as a company that we license SaaS solutions that help leaders, meet their student compliance goals and their enrollment requirements. And they're closely tied together. And we'll talk a little bit about how that all fits. And the way that we do that is, of course, we want to make it easier to gather accurate information, because all the information that feeds into your processes and the student information system gets generated as part of that onboarding process. Obviously, there's some accuracy that needs to be verified. We'll talk a little bit about that. And just in terms of both internal and external policies, helping with all of that. So that's kind of where we fit in. We have 3 products that kind of fit into this area. The first is an application for admissions product. The second is a residency, financial aid, and citizenship compliance solution. And the third is a continuing education enrollment solution. And again, in terms of our partnership with Grooper, we're really leveraging all of the capabilities that they have in terms of, processing documents and getting good information out of it, managing it, all of the other things that are part of that. Because a big piece of what we're talking about is going to be not just getting information from the student, but can you trust the information that they're providing you? Is it accurate? And so we'll talk a little bit about all of that. So in terms of the agenda, we've already covered the introductions, but what I like to do is I like to start talking about some of the trends that we're seeing that's driving some of this. Because what we're finding is that this is an area that a lot of institutions are highly focused on today. And we'll talk a little bit about why. And then we'll talk about just how we work together to improve some of those results. We'll have a demonstration as part of that. And even though I have a topic here for Q&A, generally, we like to monitor the questions pane. So if there's a question that comes up that's kind of, that comes up as part of what we're covering, we usually find it's better to cover it like right then and there, as opposed to waiting till the end. So don't hesitate to ask any questions. So let's talk about some of the trends. And one of the ones that I wanted to talk about is just residency, immigration, and financial aid compliance. This is something that we believe is going to be, or we're actually seeing, is a big challenge that institutions are facing. And there's a lot more coming in terms of that. A lot of focus on citizen and immigration. Are your students, what is their status on that? From a residency perspective, a lot of states are taking a look and saying, all right, well, from that perspective, are you meeting the requirements for that? And they're actually changing and tightening some of those policies down. In fact, we're working with a number of institutions in the state of Florida. And from a residency perspective, they are going to be changing what those requirements are and really raising the bar in terms of what an institution has to do to prove that somebody meets their residency requirements. And then financial aid. And this is going to be a big one, especially with some of the news coming out about the Department of Education and how they're looking to change those processes. And there's going to be a lot of fights as part of that as well, which basically means that there isn't going to be clarity probably until later on in the process. And so anything you can do to streamline processing that is going to help you in the long run. And then of course, we're talking about public institutions. There's, increased scrutiny in how they enroll students. There's going to be a number of regulatory changes. We're seeing that already. And one of the things that we're seeing is that there's going to be less guidance on how to adhere to those regulations. Again, a perfect example is what we're seeing in Florida, where the Department of Education in Florida has removed their guidelines on how to adhere to their residency requirements down there. And part of it is that they want the schools to, and their legal departments to really understand the regulations and do that themselves, which basically, again, adds some additional ownership from the institution's perspective. The other thing that we're seeing is, of course, from a government efficiency perspective, basically, and again, I'm talking a little bit about Florida because they're, what I view is that they are one of the states that's doing this more quickly than we'll see in some of the other states as well, or at the federal government level. But again, they're tasked with eliminating unnecessary spending. This is actually an executive order by DeSantis that established a DOGE task force. And if you notice, they want institutions to use technology better. They wanted them to use advanced technology and specifically artificial intelligence to eliminate waste. And so, again, we'll talk a little bit about how we're able to do that as part of these processes. And again, one of the things that becomes really important is just the intersection between compliance and gathering the information you need as a new student, comes into your institution, because there's a big amount of interplay between the two. And so as you look at your student intake processes, there's a lot of policies that you have to comply with. Are they qualified to even take the courses that they want to take? Do they qualify from a citizenship immigration perspective, a residency perspective, financial aid, maybe in terms of vaccination, criminal background, other things like that? And so as part of that, you need to basically get the information. You can't just trust what they say at face value. You have to actually gather things to prove that and verify that. And that's really where a lot of what we're talking about today comes in. And so if we just wanted to kind of boil that down to some of the benefits of using AI in the onboarding process, specifically with what we're doing with Grooper in terms of processing documents, essentially it improves the user experience because you can actually use the documents for data entry as opposed to typing it in yourself. You can improve the quality of the data because, again, if you're importing it from the documents, you are not having typos or having people try to game the system. From a compliance perspective, you are much more prepared to prove that you are complying with different policies. From a fraud perspective, this is a big one, because what we've seen in a lot of institutions is that there's a lot of fraudulent enrollments that come in. And for some schools, that goes so far as to actually setting them up with an email in the student information system, or in their systems, giving them access to Microsoft and other things like that, or even taking financial aid and then canceling it. And so the interesting thing is that this has a significant impact on making it a lot more difficult for people to commit fraud. And then finally, just the processing. There's a significant amount of time that's spent by institutions to actually just process new students. So how can you streamline that? And these have some pretty big impacts, right? So if you can decrease the amount of effort of your students to go through the admissions process, we're seeing close to 80% improvement in terms of enrollment results. That has a big impact on your funnel volume and being able to meet your enrollment goals and that sort of thing. And from a verification perspective, it can be anywhere from 60 to 80% reduction in the amount of processing effort that you're going through to just gather documents, verify that they're accurate, making sure that you understand what the policies are that apply to all of those sorts of things. You can really do a lot in terms of increasing that productivity. And so just to kind of describe who is doing what in this, I've alluded to this, but in essence, you can kind of think of what Mutara does is we provide kind of that front end with understanding all of the compliance rules, gathering whatever information needs to be gathered. So if it's an application for admissions, it's generating all of the data. If it's something related to, for example, financial aid, where you may be reacting to ICER records or ICER exceptions, then we would pull out the data that's known about the student and make sure that we gather the appropriate documents based on what those C flags are and things like that. And so the idea is that we integrate with those and do all of that. The real benefit that Grooper provides is that, number one, it will go through and verify, is this an accurate document? It will classify those documents. It will extract information. And on the flip side, as we get into some of the things in our roadmap related to, proving compliance and that sort of thing, being able to search for in an audit and managing all of that sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about the AI process. And again, if you're familiar with Grooper, I may be reviewing some things that you're very familiar with. But again, what I wanted to do is just kind of describe how that fits in and then how we work with that. So from the perspective of this, we're going to use a driver's license as an example. But again, the idea is this can be any document. So for example, when you start looking at, financial aid compliance, there's, upwards of 20 different types of documents that somebody may need to provide based on whatever type of exception comes in. And so the classification becomes important. But from the perspective of what we're talking about today, we'll just drill into the driver's license. So from a driver's license perspective, of course, the first step is you upload that, and then Grooper will sit there and say, okay, I know what this is. This is a birth certificate. This is a driver's license. Now, one of the important pieces is that it also will understand, understand different types of driver's license as well as different years, because driver's license formats do change over time. And so again, the idea is that using AI to classify that takes a big step out of the process, because now at the time that you're capturing the document, you can say, hey, this is not the document, this is not a document that really supports what you're trying to prove here. The second piece is the extraction, right? So on the document itself, it has all sorts of information already on it. And because it's coming from something that is a system of record, it basically, you can trust that data a lot more than you can trust the data that somebody types into a page. So if you can extract that data automatically, you can trust the data, and it actually takes out a lot of the effort from the student's perspective. And that fits into, at least from our process, three different places in the compliance process. So again, if we look at how we handle things like financial aid verification, the first step is gathering that accurate information. So if you can upload a document or take a picture of a document that's, and use that as gathering the information, then again, that streamlines that whole process. And then the second step is just verifying that it's authentic and that it has meaning in the process, right? You want to make sure that, that is this, based on, for example, the type of residency that they're claiming, does this document make sense for that? So you have to kind of understand the rules in terms of the mapping of the document to the policy, as well as the other information about the student. And then the third piece is you need to prove that compliance to regulators. So if you're having audits every year, having things that kind of, with AI to kind of, help you in terms of navigating that process will be important as well. So let's just kind of show you what I'm talking about. So I'm going to switch over here and go to a demo site here. So again, this is kind of our user interface. We set this up for the purposes of today's demo. And you'll notice that I can go in and provide my login information. So let me do that first. Put in a password. Let me go get my password from my password manager. Hold on one second. There it is. Okay. And I'm going to upload a document, and let's go get this here. There's the driver's license. So by doing that upload, it actually kicked in. It happened pretty quickly, the Grooper process. One of the things that we got in terms of some feedback with this was that they would prefer, some people would prefer to see the exact data, before it actually pulls you into the application here. But you'll notice that it pulled out the first name of sample. It pulled out the last name of Florida. It pulled out my gender. It pulled out my date of birth. If I go to the contact page, it pulled out the address from the driver's license. So again, by uploading that document and processing what's in there, I didn't have to enter any of that. And that's really kind of what we're talking about. And so you can imagine, again, that this data is trusted, as well as it's, again, made it a lot easier for the student to go through that process. And that's really what we're talking about. So this could happen as part of the getting started process. So I want to start an application for admissions. So, getting the data to start there, and driver's license is one example, but obviously we could use passports, we could use birth certificates, that sort of thing. Obviously, I've already shown gathering the address. So if for some reason you decide that you're going to create the account manually, we still would have the ability to upload the document to get the person's address and other information as part of that process. This becomes important as you start looking at some of the verification pieces. And then on the citizenship piece, this is a big one as well, because there's a lot of information on your citizenship documents that you have to go through. And what is my visa type? When does it expire? All of that information, extracting all of that means, again, that it's all accurate and you can trust it from that perspective. And so those are some of those key pieces, because, again, when you have an auditor coming in and saying, all right, are you complying with the different policies? You can say, well, here are all the things that we're doing. And our standard process is that they have to upload the document first in order to get the data out of it so that we are sure that that information is accurate. And then finally, on the financial aid side, you may notice, for example, and this is an example on the financial aid side where maybe, somebody comes in and they say, okay, you notify them that there's some issue that needs to be addressed. And so in this circumstance, this person has 4 different exceptions and they've already provided their birth certificate. So we extracted the data out of the birth certificate to actually prove that, what is correct from that perspective. You'll notice that we have a few other ones and we can upload other documents as part of that. So 2 of these exceptions require the DD form 214 because they're military related. So again, uploading that, extracting the data out, keeping both allows you to really streamline that whole process. And so the idea is that we want to provide a simple experience for the student. So again, anything we can do to eliminate data entry and mouse clicks is really important. Reduce the processing effort through automation of your policy enforcement. That's a big piece of what we build and what we manage as part of that. Integrate with the systems of record for validation and handling of corrections. So, for example, when we go back to the financial aid side, there's already data generally in the student information system about that person. So we can actually compare what came in from the ICER record to what is in the student information system to what is in the document. And so that allows us to make the appropriate decisions in terms of how to move forward. And then finally, utilizing artificial intelligence. So, we described and kind of showed an example where we're actually pulling data out of a driver's license, but any document becomes, is something that we can do from that perspective. And so in terms of just, again, kind of describing what we saw and what the different steps are, again, there are a number of key steps, right? The first one is just determining those policy compliance rules, gathering the information for verification, extracting the data, verifying the data, and updating the systems of record. And I'm using financial aid as an example because the process is not that different from other use cases that we've talked about. And so, for example, in terms of what we saw for financial aid, obviously, the Department of Education is what sends you the ICER records that say these are the exceptions for these people. So when the student goes in and logs in, obviously they need to authenticate themselves because it's personally identifiable information that they're working with. So they need to do that. That talks to your identity management solution. And as I said, we have the information from the Department of Education. We have the information we're pulling in from the student information system. That tells us, what do we need to gather? So we gather the information, we send it off to Grooper. Grooper classifies and extracts the data. Then we might need to do some additional verification. So in some circumstances, we might decide that we want to, use the APIs to contact the DMV that says, here's the information I extracted. Is what we've extracted correct from your perspective? And then finally, we need to do the updates. So for example, if the name is incorrect or the social security number is incorrect, then we might have to update both the student information system and send a record to the correction file to the Department of Education. So these are kind of all of those types of steps that we're talking about. And again, if you're doing these things manually, because any one of these steps, I see a lot of institutions doing that manually, right? People are sending, are coming in person or mailing these documents or things like that. People, if you have a document management system, you still might, if you're not using AI, you still might have to have people go through and look at every single document and tie out, do these documents match what we understand about it? And are they relevant and things like that? And so if you can automate all of that, you're reducing the amount of effort. But as we talk about some of the things with the Department of Education and some of the uncertainty in terms of what the process is going to look like going forward, you don't have, if you're not spending as much time processing every single student, that means that you'll be able to react more quickly when things do finalize. And you don't have to worry as much about, great, I can't, all of these people who we think are qualified for financial aid, we can't enroll them because we can't give them a complete answer yet in terms of whether they qualify or not. And just from the perspective of what I'm talking about, I've talked a little bit, a lot about AI. Hopefully it kind of makes sense in terms of a lot of the things that we're doing. But in terms of where you use it, right? Because that's the important piece. I mean, AI is this interesting concept and it does some amazing things. But what we've seen is that a lot of institutions and a lot of organizations just have challenges figuring out how to apply it in a way that's going to benefit them. And so the interesting thing is that when you start talking about things, so let's, for example, go back to financial aid as an example. So if I need to deal with financial aid information, well, a lot of times, if the student has listed your institution as a recipient of their FAFSA information, then you already have that information before they even started an application for admissions. So you could gather all of those documents during the application for admissions. Now, if you may or may not be able to do that. The second step is the decision-making side. So for example, if you are a selective institution that uses a product like Slate, then you might incorporate into the workflow of Slate how you actually, getting that information, right? So great, I'm already getting information like letters of recommendation and things like that. So why not get all of the other information about that I need to kind of deal with, whatever financial verification issues there are. But what we're seeing more institutions do is really do it as part of the pre-enrollment checklist, right? So the student has accepted admission, and then you go through the process and say, all right, well, before you can enroll in classes, you need to provide the missing documentation for financial aid or something like that. And then, of course, the last piece is that someone's status may change as time goes on. Maybe they switch from being on an F1 visa to having a green card or something like that, or from a residency perspective, they now qualify as a resident. You might need to do a reclassification process, which again is the same sort of thing where you have to get the supporting documentation and all of that sort of thing. So, that's kind of what we were looking at from this perspective. So again, we kind of covered, what the trends are, what the impact is. Hopefully you kind of got a view as to what we're doing together and how that can streamline your processes in terms of student intake, compliance, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Thanks, Larry. We do have a couple of questions here that came up. I didn't want to interrupt you because you were you're deep in your speech. So you had mentioned Slate. So the question came up is what SISs we support. And I know Slate's not an SIS, but let's talk about the ecosystem that you guys are able to handle.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we can support any of your student information systems. So, so we're talking about, of course, Ellucian, we're talking about Workday, we're talking about PeopleSoft. We've been doing a lot of work recently with PeopleSoft, and part of it is just because that's where I worked for a number of years. So I know a lot of institutions and people there. But yeah, we can work with any of those. We can work with Slate, or if you have other CRMs you want to use, we can work with that as well. So yeah, I mean, we basically are agnostic from that perspective.
Great. And I know that we're working with you specifically because of your experience on PeopleSoft. So we can kind of back that play that you guys have some good expertise that which is kind of the fundamentals of our partnership, right?
Yep. Thank you.
And then the other question we have is, how would this apply if you use the Common App? I know that there's quite a few people that are on these, on Common App. So how does that fit into this?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand that question a little bit because, again, if we start looking at Slate as another example, a lot of institutions will have an application for admissions that isn't, that's, and in fact, some states have their own common app as well. So like Apply Texas or California has their own common app. And so basically the way that our solution works, and I'm going to go back to the financial aid example here, because I think this is a perfect example of that. So yes, we can do a lot of this in the application for admissions, which means that you're not having to go back and ask for information multiple times at a later point in time. But again, when you don't have that as an option, then essentially what we do is we'll pull the information out of the student information system once it comes in. So for example, if you're using the Common App, you get those feeds from the Common App, you load them into whatever system, whether it's directly into your student information system or into a product like Slate. And then from that perspective, what we can do is we can pull what's already known about the student as the starting point for what we're doing. So they don't have to re-enter data that they've already entered before. And then we're just providing a user experience that says, okay, well, here are the things that you need to provide now that, either is in conflict or that we just need more supporting information. And so that's kind of how we do it. And so that's why it's really important to have this integration back to the student information system so that we can pull the information out at the starting point. So if the data isn't created directly through our user experience, and then we can send the results back to it once we've gone through all that logic.
Got you. Perfect. Well, look at you. You're efficient. We're right at the bottom of the hour. If we don't have any more questions from anyone, it looks like we're clear. Give it a second to see if anybody wants to ask one final question. Okay. Going once, going twice. Then what we will do, appreciate everybody for joining. What we'll do, we'll be following up with a link to the recorded email. And I think that's about it. Larry, did you have anything else we needed to cover or we missed?
No, I think that's it.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate your time today, as always. And thanks, everybody, for joining. We'll look forward to hearing from you soon, and we'll be following up with you shortly. Thank you much.
Thank you.